Welcome once again to Along the Rio Grande. I'm George Torok, and today we have in our studio David Conrad. He's a steam locomotive restoration specialist, and he's doing the restoration work on old engine number 1. David, welcome to the program today.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Maybe we could start out by just explaining what old engine number 1 is.
Well, it's a steam locomotive, and of course that in itself makes it unique. At one time there were several 100,000 steam locomotives in existence in the United States, and now today there are less than 1,900 in the entire North American continent. So just the fact that it's a steam locomotive makes it unique. But in addition to that, it's one of the oldest steam locomotives in existence. And not only in the United States, but in the entire world. It's one of the oldest locomotives. It was built in 1857, and so it's very nearly 150 years old.
Now, steam locomotive ran on steam power. How did that work? It's different than the types of trains that we would see today, right?
Certainly. A steam locomotive is external combustion rather than internal combustion. And typical steam locomotives have a firebox at one end of the pressure vessel. The firebox is surrounded by water. There's a water jacket around the firebox, and the firebox is connected to the front end of the locomotive through a series of fire tubes, and the heat and the hot gases and the smoke go through those tubes and eventually up the smokestack. And the heat transfer mostly takes place in the firebox, but some of the heat transfer also takes place in the tubes, and eventually, after you've heated the water long enough, it boils, it makes steam, and since the pressure vessel is a contained object, the pressure accumulates in there and builds up pressure, and ultimately you can build up enough pressure to actually operate the engines that drive the locomotive. And typical steam locomotives have 2 cylinders, and one's mounted on each side of the locomotive, and they're double acting cylinders. That is, they first get steam on the front side of the piston and then on the back side of the piston. That's different than your automobile, which gets power only on one side of the piston. So the pistons work back and forth, and the exhaust steam from the pistons goes up the stack. And what's neat about that is that as the exhaust steam goes up the stack, it creates a partial vacuum in the smoke box, which draws the heat and the hot gases through the tubes. And the harder the engine works up to a certain point, the more steam it can produce, because the more airflow that's drawn through the fire, the hotter the fire burns and the more fuel that can be consumed, and thereby the more steam can be generated.
How do you heat the water? What do they use to do that?
Well, the earliest locomotives in the United States were wood burners because we had vast forests. But as the forests got cut down and as it became more and more expensive to haul wood farther and farther to feed the locomotives, railroads went to burning coal. And there were some early coal burners even as early as the 1840s, but it really took the development of the bituminous coal fields before coal really got to be a popular fuel. And some parts of the country, once oil was discovered, went to burning oil for fuel in the locomotives. A lot of the Southwest and South used oil for fuel. But of course, number 1, the locomotive we're talking about, it was last operated in 1903, and that's really at the very beginnings of oil-fired locomotives, so it was never converted. It was originally built as a wood burner, and then later on it was converted to coal.
Now, steam engines are kind of popular today as tourist attractions. When were they phased out? When did we lose steam locomotives?
The steam locomotive started to decline actually just before the Second World War. That was when the first successful diesel locomotives were developed, and the war intervened and kind of prolonged the steam era. So during the War Production Board only permitted certain manufacturers to build a certain number of diesel locomotives. And of course, a lot of the diesel engines that were made during the war were made for military service. Right. And at any rate, after the Second World War, that's when steam really took a real decline as far as its use on the American railroads. Most railroads had eliminated steam locomotives by the mid-1950s. There were a few that kept a few steam locomotives running up until the 1960s, but by the 60s, the only steam locomotives were either running in industrial service or some little short lines that just couldn't afford to buy a diesel locomotive, or in excursion service. A number of major railroads kept a couple of steam locomotives to use in excursion service. And of course, that's how I first gotten interested really in steam locomotives rather than, models and whatnot. I lived in Chicago, and the Burlington Railroad had 2 steam locomotives which they operated, and I saw an ad in the newspaper and started going on excursions with steam locomotive. And I've always loved steam locomotives, even when I was a little tiny child. Always liked the locomotives, but of course there was a phase there where I was more interested in the models. Right. And but as soon as I started seeing the real thing, I soon left the models behind and pursued steam locomotives just to photograph them, to ride behind them, to ride on them if possible.
Now, a steam locomotive restoration specialist, this is a fairly unusual occupation.
This is true.
How do you become one of those? What kind of training or what?
Really, it's George, it's mostly learned by doing. When I was in Chicago, I lived in Chicago for a number of years, and when I was in Chicago, there was a fellow who had a bread truck route which stopped near my house, and this guy owned a steam locomotive, a full-size big steam locomotive, and he operated on excursions. And one day, I was chatting with him, as was my usual habit on Saturday mornings, and he invited me to come down the next day and help him on his locomotive. And I didn't have anything to do that day, so I went down, and as soon as I started working on the locomotive, I was hooked. It was one of those kind of epiphanies where all of a sudden, the light goes on, and you figure out, what I really like to do. Exactly. And I finished school, and I taught for a few years, but I used to spend a lot of time in my classroom looking out the window thinking if I was out, I could be doing this or that or the other thing. And by that time, I had become involved with a volunteer museum, Illinois Railway Museum at Union, Illinois. And Illinois Railway Museum is the world's largest railroad museum. It has over 450 pieces of equipment. We have over 150 acres, and there's yards and buildings, and it's a fabulous place. And of course, when I started there, it wasn't quite that fabulous. I helped with the acquisition of locomotives, and also with the restoration of the locomotives, because the saying out at Illinois Railway Museum is them's that wants does. And there's no paid staff, it's all volunteer. And so if we found out about a locomotive that was in a scrap yard or abandoned somewhere, it was up to us to write the letters, to negotiate for the acquisition of the locomotive, and if we got the locomotive, then we'd write letters to the railroads trying to convince them that they should move this thing for us for nothing. And I would organize locomotive rescue projects, and we rescued a number of locomotives during the time that I was out there. And of course, once you get them drugged back to the museum, well, then you have to work on them. And so
What kind of skills did you need to develop to restore locomotives? How do you get started on that?
Well, you get started just by having to do things. For instance, the first steam locomotive that I worked on, it had to have all of its machinery put back together. It was dismantled. And so I had to figure out, where all the parts went. And that meant looking in books, looking at blueprints, things like that. And I was not trained to do any of this. Truthfully, I never hardly picked up a wrench before I started working on steam locomotives. But
So you don't have a formal mechanical or engineering background?
no, no, sir, no, sir. And in fact, it's unusual for guys who work on steam locomotives to have a real formal background. There are a few that have come up through some kind of mechanical trades or have actually been apprentices in railroad shop programs, but most of us do it because we like it, and because we like it so much, we learn about it. And it means hitting the books and sometimes, finding the books, because a lot of books are very obscure.
Sure.
But there are certain texts which, for instance, if you went on eBay, you could find various books which are standards. And by reading and by actually finding problems that have to be solved that no one else is going to solve unless you solve them,
sure,
you teach yourself. And I remember when we first had some air brake difficulties at the Illinois Railway Museum, well, we didn't have anybody out there who was an air brake specialist. And so it was a situation where I had to sit down with the books and figure out how these valves worked, and then carefully take them apart and look at all the parts. And luckily, there was an old fellow that was not a museum member, but was sympathetic. And, he'd look at the parts. He'd say, oh, yeah, well, this is scored, and you're going to have to grind this in. And I'd be taking parts back and forth to him. And ultimately, I got to be, pretty good at repairing air brake valves. And so when other people at the museum had air brake troubles, they'd come to me, and I'd give them advice. And I built up a bit of knowledge about air brake valves. And we had a locomotive which we wanted to run, but the boiler tubes were leaking. And so we learned how to remove boiler tubes and put in new boiler tubes. And just learning by doing. And along the way, we were lucky enough to find some old timers that would give us advice and counsel, and sometimes lend us tools. And little by little, I built up a basis of knowledge. And what's kind of interesting about the steam locomotive specialists today, we have to be generalists.
Sure.
When steam locomotives were in regular operation, there were back shops which repaired the locomotives, and roundhouses where they repaired the locomotives. And inside the roundhouse, there were boilermakers and machinists and tinsmiths and coppersmiths and pipe fitters and air brake men, and the guys had specialties. And there wasn't an awful lot of crossing over of the crafts. Right. If you were a boilermaker, pretty much you stayed a boilermaker. And so today, we don't have back shops like that. Sure. And a few of the museums do have pretty good sized shops, but typically everybody in there has to be a generalist. You have to be able to one day do air brake work, and another day roll boiler tubes, and another day machine up a pin or a bushing or something like that. So you pick up a wide range of skills.
Now, engine number one project, we found you in Connecticut, right?
This is true. I have a full-time job at the Valley Railroad at Essex, Connecticut. This is our commercial message. And the Valley Railroad is a for-profit corporation. It runs a 13-mile scenic railroad, and we have 2 operating steam locomotives and an operating diesel locomotive as well. And we run a scenic railroad which conveys people from our base in Essex to a town called Deep River, where we have a dock where passengers can transfer over to a boat to go on an hour-long boat trip up and down the Connecticut River, and they catch the next train back to Essex. We also run a dinner train which runs over our entire railroad. So we have this going on, and if everything is going good at the railroad, the bosses don't mind if I take off and do contract jobs like this.
So that's how we got you here.
This is true. And Florence Schwein from UTEP tracked me down a few years ago. She wanted some guidance as to where to go with the number one. It was sitting in a building at UTEP, and it was obviously deteriorating, and she wanted some advice. And so she asked around, and my name came up. I've done restorations for Henry Ford Museum, for Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, for various places. So it's immodest, but my name is kind of a household word when it comes to locomotive restorations. I'm one of the people that, when you're looking for somebody, I'm one of the people that gets called. I don't always get the job, but I do get called occasionally.
And this engine attracted your attention, I imagine.
Well, it did, because, you know, most of the locomotives that I've worked on, George, have been more modern locomotives. Right. Locomotives built in the 1920s, 30s, even later. And to work on a locomotive built in 1857, well, you know, that was interesting. That was very interesting. And of course, the number one, even without being as old as it is an interesting locomotive technology-wise.
How's that?
The design of the locomotive is it's a little on the archaic side. If you look at the locomotive, the cylinders, instead of being perfectly horizontal, the cylinders are mounted on a little bit of a slant. Oh. And that was typical of very old locomotives. And of course, the type of frame the locomotive has is an odd frame. It's a slab-type frame, which was only used in the United States for a very short period of time by a very few number of builders. And one of the things that really attracted me to the locomotive and to the project was how much of the original machine was still there.
Sure.
Now, what's original? Well, you know, the locomotive last ran in 1903.
Okay.
So we know that no mechanical work has been done on it since 1903. It was restored in 1909 to be put on display here in El Paso in front of the old El Paso Southwestern office building. We have documentation that they spent about a month doing the restoration on the locomotive in 1909, and it was described as being in the paint shop for a month. So most of the work that was done on the locomotive was cosmetic work. Sure. Woodwork, filling wood, painting it. And since 1909, aside from being taken out and used in a movie in 1938, not much has been done to it except it's been painted year after year. And, you know, we replaced some glass here and there, but basically it's just had cosmetic work on it. Now,
and then it was put on display.
It's been on display 1909 right up until a month and a half ago or so. Sure. When it was taken off display. Now, that's the history of the locomotive basically from 1903 to 2002. Now, before 1903, we have the engine being built in 1857, and some of the parts of the locomotive date back to 1857.
Oh, really?
Now, it's difficult to say with certainty exactly what, but we're pretty sure that the frame of the locomotive is original from 1857. The driving wheel centers, the boiler, and the outer firebox are original. And it's very possible that the tender and the tender frame also are original. Now, why do we say this? The frame, it's a very odd frame, and anyone who'd rebuild the locomotive anytime would not use a frame like that. So it's pretty certain the frame is original. The wheel centers, the design of the spokes is a little peculiar. They're very beautifully cast spokes, and typically when railroads rebuilt locomotives, they didn't go to the same amount of care in a rebuild that the builder would go to in building the locomotive in the first place. The builders were making, a product that was going to last. And the railroads, when they were rebuilding things, they just wanted them to last for a finite amount of time.
Sure.
You know, the rebuild was going to
few
last
more
for
years
5
out of it,
years,
right.
exactly, a few more years out of it. So we think that the wheel centers are original. The boiler is made up of numerous small plates. Now, 1857, the largest plates for boilerplate that were being rolled were fairly small. So you had to make a lot of small plates and then rivet them all together to build your boiler, the full-size boiler. By the 1870s, we were rolling much larger pieces of steel. Therefore, had the boiler been replaced, it probably would have been replaced with a steel boiler made up out of about a fourth the number of sections as this one is. The cab of the locomotive appears to be about half new and about, or half replacement and about half original. We've stripped the cab down to bare wood, and we find that about half the cab is mahogany. And mahogany, then as now, was an expensive wood.
Sure.
You didn't use mahogany for quick repairs. Mahogany was something used for furniture and for making nice finished objects like a locomotive cab. We figure that the cab has, maybe it was damaged, who knows, but just about a half of the cab is made up out of oak. There's some poplar, and there's also some pine. And we're figuring that those are replacement parts. So a good bit of the cab is original. Difficult to say about the tender. It's very old. It's been patched a lot of times. So we're not sure about the tender tank. The tender frame, however, is wood. And after 1870, no one used wood for building tender frames. So it's our supposition that the tender frame is original from the building of the locomotive, or if not original from 1857, original from at least around 1870 or so.
Right.
So regardless of what piece of the locomotive you're talking about, it's all original to some extent, either original to 1909, original to some point between its building and when it was taken out of service in 1903.
Now, in order to work on this, you had to move it out of the museum to somewhere that you could perform all these things. How did we move it, and where is it?
Well, we contracted, I should say, the city of El Paso contracted with Southwestern Industrial Contractors Riggers to move the locomotive. And Southwestern's expertise is in cranes and rigging. They have big, huge cranes. And what we had to do was to get the locomotive out of that little building that it was in there at UTEP. Now, it would have been possible to tear down the building around the locomotive and take it out, somewhat easier, but we would have run the risk of damaging the locomotive during the dismantling process of the building. So my recommendation was that we roll the locomotive out of the building onto like a trestle, and Southwestern had a better idea. They set up one of their trailers. Interestingly enough, the trailer that moved the locomotive into UTEP in 1960,
wow.
Same trailer, they set it up with a couple of cranes, and they set it in front of the locomotive, in front of the building, and held it there as the locomotive, the tracks were connected up and the locomotive was pulled out with a come-along, which is just a mechanical device which can pull. And we'd previously prepared the locomotive for movement. We got the thing broke free so that it would roll easily. We got all the parts lubricated and disconnected the engine and tender and got the smokestack ready for taking off and whatnot. So when Southwestern got their trailer dangled in front of the locomotive, they pulled it on, and then with the two cranes, picked it up, set it down on the street, and hooked a tractor onto it and drove it over to the shop. And the next day they repeated the process with the tender.
And just briefly, what things have you been able to do to the locomotive up to this point? What processes did you have to carry out?
Well, one of the first things you have to do in a project like this is do a real thorough inspection. And I had looked at the locomotive when it was at UTEP and had a fairly good idea of what problems we were going to encounter with the locomotive, but it isn't until you actually have the thing where you can get underneath it easily and crawl around on it for a couple of days before you really start getting a sense of what you have to work with there. And so we spent some time inspecting the locomotive, and then and during that process, planning how we were going to dismantle it. We had to, for instance, with the cab of the locomotive, we picked up the cab with beams set through the windows and picked up on basically on the roof of the cab. That's because the roof of the cab was the most substantial portion. The bottom of the cab was badly rotted, and so we didn't want to pick up on the bottom. If we'd picked up on the bottom of the cab, we would have crushed it. So we picked up on the top, we picked up from the top and set it down on stands so that we could work on the bottom of the cab prior to letting the cab rest on its bottom. And so as I say, we planned out the project so that we figured out how to dismantle it without damaging anything. And of course, this is one of the things. I mean, it's almost like the physician's oath. I mean, we don't want to do any harm to the thing. We want to try to save every bit that we possibly can.
So we're working on the wood, and we're working on the metal parts, and removing rust, and trying to get it cosmetically to look the way that it did around the turn of the century? Is that
the goal of the restoration project is to return the locomotive to its appearance as it was in 1909 when it was first put on display. That's our goal as stated in the contract with City of El Paso. And so what we've been doing thus far is conservation work on the wood and on metal, and also replacement of whatever missing parts there are or whatever is not repairable. We found that the ash pan of the locomotive was so badly rusted out that we couldn't repair it. So we saved as many of the bits and pieces of it as we could, hinges, hangers and whatnot, and we built a reproduction ash pan.
Well, this is certainly a fascinating project, and it sounds like you've done some tremendous work on it. David, we want to thank you for coming in today and telling us a little bit about this, and maybe we can have you back when it's all finished and we can take a look at the final product.
It'd be my pleasure to show you.
And we want to thank all of you as well for joining us today on Along the Rio Grande, and we hope to see you on our next program.